This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Squash Canada's Coach Professional Development webinar series. Today's topic, I think everyone is going to really like. It is called How to Create a Squash Training Plan for You and Your Athletes, presented by Nicole Bunyan, who is a member of our Squash Canada National Squad. She has been a professional squash player, currently ranked number 60 in the world. She is a NASM certified personal trainer. She's a precision nutrition level 1 nutrition coach, and she likes to say she's a self-proclaimed training geek. So she's going to provide her wisdom and knowledge to you today on how to create a squash training plan. And speaking from some personal experience with Nicole helping me with some training, she is very, very knowledgeable, and I think you're going to enjoy today's presentation. Just a quick couple of housekeeping rules. If you have questions, today's presentation is designed to be interactive. Nicole's going to go through kind of the bulk of the presentation, but then have more of a heavy weighted Q&A at the end. So save your questions to the end, and we will get to them. Whether we unmute mics or type them in the chat is fine, but just hang them until the end of the presentation, and Nicole will do all of that at one time. There's also a Google Doc that we had sent around in advance, so we encourage you to keep that open because Nicole will reference that throughout the presentation. Other than that, we hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Take it away, Nicole.
Okay, hi guys, welcome to this webinar. So yeah, when Jeff asked me what I might want to talk about, I thought, well, I think that something that I hear a lot about, I get a lot of questions about, is how to integrate all the different methods that we need for squash training or as squash players into a weekly plan. Because, I mean, you guys know the game of squash, we need strength, we need conditioning, we need mobility, we need agility, we need power, we need speed, etc. Right? And then we also have to recover at some point. So I thought it would be good to kind of touch on all of these methods and then go through some examples as well as to how to include them into different training plans. So that's kind of what we're going to do today. So you can see here, we're going to quickly go over periodization. We're not going to focus on it too much, but I just want to give you an idea as to how what we're talking about today is going to integrate into like a monthly or a yearly plan. We're all going to focus most of our time on the training block. So what your particular focus is going to be for a period of training. And then we're going to dive into the essential elements that you need in a squash training program. We're going to go through some examples, like I said, of how to plan a week of training. And then finally, we'll get to a Q&A if you've got any questions. So welcome. Jeff gave me a nice little intro there, but I'm Nicole. I'm from Victoria, BC, but I currently live in Stamford, Connecticut. I'm playing on the Pro Tour. And I went to university in the States as well. And ever since, I've been doing personal training and have been playing on the tour. And just in the last year, I started an online squash training business, which I've called Squashletic. The idea being you need some athleticism to play squash. All right, so that's kind of the little intro to me. So we're gonna, okay, so just a quick background on my training philosophy. My training philosophy is pretty much backed on evidence-backed principles and also my own experience. And part of the reason that I've dug into the squash scene is because I found that there is such a lack of knowledge surrounding proper training for squash. Everyone seems to think that you need to do 5 million kinds of lunges to train for squash, or if it resembles a lunge, then you can call it squash-specific training. But the reality is that a lot of the training you do off the court is going to be general in nature because you need a fundamental base of strength, conditioning, and mobility. So my goal for today is to teach you which sessions should be mostly general, which sessions can be more specific to squash, and also how to bridge the gap in between the two. So ideally, I want you to walk away knowing which types of sessions you are going to integrate, like strength, conditioning, and mobility, how to integrate them, how often, and when you're going to do them within. So just a quick thing on periodization. Periodization is just a fancy word for planning, basically, in order to split up your training into different phases throughout the year. So the macro cycle is just the overall year, right? So broken up into like off season and in season. A mesocycle is a particular phase or training block, which we're going to be covering a bit. And then what we're going to be spending most of our time focusing on is the microcycle, the smallest unit, you could say, of these cycles. And this is a week, okay? So a week of training. And then finally, this is also what we're going to be spending time on, and this is the individual sessions themselves. So this is where we're going to be programming. So programming sessions or programming exercises. All right, so let's talk quickly about the training block. And this is important to, it's really important to focus on two key elements when choosing what to focus on a particular training block. And the two things I think are most important are, one, to identify the time of year. So whether you're in season or you're out of season. And two, you want to look at your goals, because we can't work on everything at the same time. We just don't have enough time or energy or mental capacity, really. So let's get to that. All right. So the first thing is the timely focus. So you want to make sure that it's really the right time to work towards that goal. For example, if you've tried to work on something technical and then you've immediately gone and you've played a tournament, you probably felt like you played horrendously, right? So this is why we make large fundamental changes in the off season. Everyone here probably knows that. And the same goes for strength and conditioning. The time to focus on improving strength, base fitness, and capacity, and to recover from overuse injuries is in the off season. Okay, so I want you to keep that in mind. Big fundamental technical changes really need to happen as far away from competition as possible. And we're not going to get into off-season versus in-season too much, because that's pretty much a whole webinar topic in itself. But it is something that is important to consider if you are wanting to change something, just that you want to make sure it's the right time to change that specific technique. So when you are looking at a training block, we need to plan with two specific goals in mind for that phase. This is my personal. Everyone, you probably have your own method for coming up with goals and focuses, but this is the way that I like to think about it, and I personally have had success with my own training in looking at it this way. So you want to look at it with, I say, two different goals, because it's very important, like we said, that you don't try and change several things at once. So I like to break it down into one technical or tactical focus. This will be purely squash based. And one physical focus, which could be either on or off the court, depending on whether you're in or out of season. So if you're out of season, you can make general changes off the court, like strength or go to the track or cycling. And then in season, you want to make your these conditioning or these physical changes mostly on the court, and mostly movement based. So this is where you're going to be doing a lot more ghosting, and we're going to get into that later. So to give you an example, my personal physical focus for the past month or so has been very movement-based. And this has integrated a lot of on-court conditioning, because I'm in the middle of season and I want to make my conditioning as specific to squash as possible. From a technical tactical point, I've been working on my technique, on the technique of my length hitting, and now I'm beginning to play more matches and integrate this into a competitive environment. So I haven't had tournaments for the past 2 months or so, but now that I am approaching a couple of tournaments, finally, I am starting to put this into practice and into a competitive environment. So if you're thinking about your game or your athletes' games and you're trying to assess their strengths and more likely you're probably coming up with a lot of weaknesses that you could fix. But I urge you to narrow it down so that you can prioritize and then you can plan effectively. So what is in a program? we are going to go over the different methods that you want to include in a program. And this is where we're going to be spending most of our attention. So here are what I consider to be the essential elements in a squash training program. So we've got solo hitting, which is mostly technical, not hugely physical. Ghosting, and this can either be technical or physical, or of course a combination of the two. Strength training, which is mainly physical, and this should be really prioritized in the off season, but you do want to include it in season, but you might just want to reduce either the intensity or the volume. Okay, so maybe you're just doing it once a week or even twice a week instead of 3 times a week. And then conditioning. Conditioning is where we're going to spend a good amount of time today. And you want to take your on-court training into account here. You don't want to just neglect how much time you're spending on. Of course, squash is very cardiovascular in nature, so we need to think about how much time we're spending doing low, medium, and high intensity work on court. And IO and power, we can train these qualities consistently. We need to be training them efficiently. And then finally, recovery. We're going to talk about that as well at the end, which is hugely underrated, I think. All right, so before we get into those methods, I do want to talk about on-court training, because lessons and drills and matches really all need to be factored into an overall training plan. So we're not going to go into as much detail as to how you'd start an on-court session, because you guys all know how to do that, and it's also not the focus of this webinar. But the main 2 things that I want you to think about are, 1, the intensity and the duration of your on-court sessions, and 2, the specific focuses, whether they are technical, tactical, or physical. And that's going to determine when you're going to do sessions and how often you are going to do them. Because we all know that a technical lesson to be as physically hard as a pressure session, and even some matches aren't as hard as others, right? So it's important that you're aware of how intense your on-court training is, so then you can adjust your off-court training accordingly, or vice versa. And the reason this is important is not just so that you're working on your specific focuses for that training block, but also so that you are dispersing intensity throughout the week, right? So let's say that you've got a pressure set. Right now, you've got a pressure session on Monday, a really hard match on Tuesday, and a ghosting session on Wednesday. That is going to be too much intensity to back, especially if you're just ramping up your training again. So you'd probably be better off spreading out those higher intensity sessions throughout the week. Let's say on a Monday, Wednesday, and a Saturday, for instance. And we're going to talk more about this through planning the week. I just want to start thinking now about how you would rate your on-court sessions on a scale of 1 to 10. So 1 would be so easy that you're not even hitting the ball. All right, you're waiting for the other person to hit it to you in warm up or something. And 10 is the absolute maximum effort, and you would definitely not be doing anything for the rest of the day, and you'd probably need a recovery day the next day. Okay, so think about where your sessions are falling on that scale. And I just want you to think about right now, if you're doing too much intensity back to back, if you're not doing enough intensity overall, or if you are actually dispersing your sessions well throughout the week. Maybe you're already doing this well and you don't even realize it. Okay, so let's go on to the next session now. So now we're going to go into all the different methods. So the first one is solo hitting. And solo hitting really isn't a method which is that usually. I mean, you can make solo hitting much more difficult. There are certainly drills that will be difficult, but for the most part, when we do solo hitting, it is usually a technical focus rather than a physical focus. And although I do recommend that, although it's not physically taxing, I do recommend that you are not fatigued for your solo sessions. And this is because solo hitting is highly, and you really need to be sharp to make it a productive session, right? There's no point practicing bad technique if you're mentally out of it. So I recommend either doing your solo hitting either earlier in the day when you're fresh, or personally, what I like to do is to do it before if you're combining it with a match or a lesson or maybe even an off-court session. It also doubles as a good warm-up before a practice or a match. And if you're working with is something that you're integrating into your own training, this is as simple as just showing up 15 30 minutes before the court time and working on that technical focus. Okay, so if you've got specific questions, solo hitting, maybe just write those down and I'll answer those at the end. Next up, we're going to talk a bit about ghosting. Okay, every kid's least favorite thing, right? So ghosting, like I mentioned earlier, is a mixture of technical and physical work. But the issue that I see most commonly is that there's not enough emphasis on the technical side of ghosting. And therefore, people, especially juniors, tend to see ghosting as just fitness. And therefore, they tend to get the most out of it, which is a shame because we all really need to work on our movement as squash players. But the thing is that ghosting is really the most specific fitness that you can do for squash. And no of running or spin classes is going to substitute ghosting, okay? And they're not going to make you a better mover on court. They will make you fitter, right? Doing and running, etc. But that coordination and that timing is really only going to come from ghosting. So there are lots of ways that you can integrate ghosting into your routine. And this will partly depend on how much of a focus it is for you at that point in your training program. For example, like I mentioned earlier, ghosting is a really large part of my training program because I'm trying to improve the efficiency of my movement. So right now, keep in mind, I'm a professional athlete, so I've got a lot more time to dedicate to this stuff. But I've got 2 hour-and-a-half sessions a week, which I know sounds like a lot, that I'd spend on ghosting with my coach. And one of these sessions is more technical and strength-based, so we are really focusing on the lunge itself. And the other session is more physical and based. If you've got any questions about that, I'm happy to answer those at the end, like about how you might want to structure specific ghosting sessions, but I just want to make sure we've got enough time to hit everything else as well. So if you want to integrate movement, but not in such a drastic manner, like if you don't want to spend an hour or an hour and a half ghosting, I certainly understand that. But you can still integrate in shorter sessions. So anywhere from, let's say, 5 to 15 minutes. You could do this before a practice, which is great because it's just going to double as a warm-up and it's going to, help. Just like with solo hitting, it's practicing the technique of the before you play. You could integrate small 5 minutes in between games or at 15-minute intervals but in a practice, or you could do it at the end of a session, maybe in the last 10 to 15 minutes of a clinic or a practice. Just make sure that if you are working on something technical with your movement, you're doing it at the beginning of the session when you're fresh. So just like I said with solo hitting, if you're working on something technical, you want to do it at the beginning when you have the most mental and physical energy. There is something to be said for doing a ghosting finisher at the end of a session, but I have found personally that mixing it into the middle is more beneficial because sometimes by the end of a session, you are just too tired to complete the movements with good form. And if you're not doing movement with good technique, then you're not improving efficiency and you're just going to be reinforcing bad habits. So I would say for ghosting, doing it sooner is better. Next up, we're going to talk about strength training. Okay, this is one of my favorites. So something that gets misinterpreted a lot is squash-specific training or even sport-specific training. And I think that people often think that for training to be beneficial for a sport, that it basically needs to mimic the sport. Okay, so for, like I said before, for squash, that means you think you got to do a bunch of lunges in the gym, weights, and doing cable rotations where you're mimicking a squash swing. But the reality is that's not actually what you need to be doing in the gym for squash training. And really, all this squash specific training is really what is being done on court, okay? So the reality is we need to the reality is that we need to build strong athletes overall. Yes, a squash player's program will differ a bit from other sports, but it's not as much as you think. So there's something that we call the 80-20 rule. And I know there are tons of 80-20 rules in the world, but for strength training, this means 80% of the strength exercises are going to be general to all sports. And then 20% of these exercises can be more specific and reflect the specific demands and positions of the sport. So this means exercises like squats, deadlifts, push-ups, rows, lunges, step-ups, planks, etc. And those are all going to be beneficial for all athletes, okay? And they should really comprise the majority of your strength program. And also keep in mind that strength training is like ticking off a box on a to-do list. Okay, we want to be efficient in the gym and not wasting time that we could be spending on court or studying if you're training student athletes, or even resting. So this means that we need to be getting our strength work in efficiently. And I would say efficiently means anywhere from 40 minutes to an hour, depending on how long you are training, what you're working on and what phase you're in. And I would say a good rule of thumb here is to be doing this about 2 times a week. I did take a little screenshot of the workout that I made, and so I just want to give you a little quick overview of what this of the rationale behind this programming. I've been following this format for years now, and I have to say that it has been the most efficient and useful program that I've ever done for strength training. Okay, from it's very well rounded. It's not going to get you injured. It's not hitting too many areas, it's not too lower body focused, then it's blowing you out for the next day. So I'm just going to give you a quick little overview of that. So you can see here we've got the pre-training warm-up as the first thing, and I wrote that in another tab. So if you want to go check that out, go for it. Then we've got the power and core section, okay? And we want to put power and core at the beginning of the session because power is highly demanding. This is something we're going to be talking about later on in another tab or another section. So to train this quality, it really needs to be done at the beginning of a session. The rationale for core work being done at the beginning as opposed to the end, which we often see, we do 8-minute ab finishers, right? The reason for that is pretty much because everyone needs to improve their and function. So why are we going to leave something that's so important to the end when we're fatigued? We talked about technique, not leaving that to the same thing goes for these important qualities like core training. Also, power and core are going to double very well as a warm-up, and particularly for core work, it activates, meaning it connects our upper and lower bodies, which are going to be working in the strength groups. So it's really a win-win to get the most out of core work if you put it at the beginning. Okay, so now we're going to go on to, I just wanted to go over this actually. I realized I didn't go through these circuits. So if we split up group 1 and group 2, the first exercise is a lower body. The second exercise is an upper body. And the third exercise is a core, a corrective, or mobility exercise. So a highly trained athlete, you might want to put a core exercise in here. And if you've got someone who is new to the gym or has a lot of mobility issues, then I would suggest putting a corrective or a mobility exercise in there. Okay, so if you've got questions about that, feel free to ask me at the end, but that is the format. And like I said, this format has worked very, very well for both my in and out of season training and for other athletes as well, of course. All right, so let's go to conditioning. So like I mentioned earlier, squash is inherently a cardiovascular sport. And also it is not predominantly anaerobic, as most people think. Squash is actually an aerobic sport. So what you need to do is look at your on-court training and decide how much off-court or supplemental training that you need to do in addition to your on training if improving your conditioning is a focus for you. So we could make a whole webinar just out of conditioning methods for squash, but I'm going to try and just hit the major points here. So the first thing I want to talk about is to follow a progression. And this means building your aerobic base first, ideally in the off season when you are further away from competition. And then gradually, every training block, you will increase either volume or intensity and decrease rest. So I would say you want to start by increasing volume, then increase the intensity, and then decrease the rest. And you can pretty much go through cycles of that, and you should see a nice trend there of improvement. And the goal, the ultimate goal, is that by the time that you are in season and ready for competition, that your conditioning work closely mimics the actual demands of squash. So this means your conditioning needs to be very similar to the work to rest ratios of squash. That is very important. Now, in general, if we're talking about out of season, want to do general methods like running and cycling and longer intervals in order to build your general aerobic base. Now, gradually, as you near the season, you want to start integrating more on-court methods. Okay, so it doesn't even have to be all ghosting, but just doing some sprints and circuits on the court environment is not just going to help the athlete become more mentally familiar with that environment, but also help the body to get used to the surface, right? Used to the court surface. Because let's not forget that turf is different from pavement, which is different from a squash floor. So the environment itself and physically adapting to the surface is a very important thing to consider when doing conditioning. Okay, you don't want to do a ton of track intervals and touch the squash court and then wonder why, your athlete is getting injured when they're doing stuff on the squash court. We've got to get used to that surface. And then the last thing I want to talk about with conditioning is, what about low impact conditioning, right? I know there are a lot of people who have injuries or maybe can't take that much impact. So for those, you want to improve your conditioning in season. This is where I would say you want to take to the bike or the rower or the climb, all of these modalities you can find in the gym. And again, stick to the same work to rest intervals that you'd find on a squash match, but just do them in a low impact manner, okay? So personally, this is something that I had to do after I had knee surgery. I was doing a lot more conditioning on the bike. And this is something I grew up doing a lot in high school, and it was a great way to balance out my high impact on-court training and while still getting conditioning. So I was really able to improve my conditioning, but not have to suffer all the pounding on my joints. See here, I just took a couple screenshots of the programs that I sent you guys. So the one on the left is a pyramid intervals workout. And this can be done, I like this to be done in a variety of ways. You can do this as a beginner who's just trying to improve if you're trying to improve your general aerobic base, or you could do this side by side with an elite athlete who is trying to improve their threshold. Okay, and maybe they would take more rest if they're going to do it for threshold, but it can definitely be a very challenging workout or a moderate workout. So that's why I like this one, because you can just alter the intensity based on what you're trying to achieve from it. And then this second one here is an on-court circuit. And so this would be something that you would want to do either in preseason or maybe in season. And I gave you a bit of a template here. I didn't put in specific exercises because that way you can adapt it as however you want to. But we've got ghosting and then a movement drill. So maybe you're going to do some sort of agility drill or a cone drill, and then into high knees or fast feet. And then we've got a similar format for the second circuit and a similar format for the third circuit. I just switched out some of the exercises. And now this circuit should be quite tough, because you can see that you're going 20 seconds with no rest. And then at the end of that circuit, so it's a minute on, and then at the end, you get a minute off. This is pretty tough, okay? But again, if you've got, I know group formats because of COVID, but if you've got an elite athlete and you've also got and you've also got someone who's more of a beginner or a club player, and they're both trying to improve their conditioning, they can both do this workout, which is why I love it, right? The elite athlete is just going to be pushing as hard as they can, right? Maximal effort to get the most out of this. Whereas perhaps the club player is just going to do this at maybe a 6 or a 7 out of 10 sort of intensity. So you can really use this format, but adapt it to different levels, which I love. Okay, we've got 2 more methods. Next one is power, agility, and speed. And these are just the 3 things everyone wants more of, right? So when training these qualities, they really need to be done at maximum intensity. Number one issue that I see when people are trying to train agility or plyometrics or power or speed is that they're actually not going fast enough, okay? So like, for instance, ask yourself, how often do you see box jumps programmed into a workout back to back with a bunch of other exercises like heavy squats? Now, actually, there is a place where that kind of does work, but that is in a one-off scenario and only for very highly trained athletes. So the general population should not be combining box jumps with heavy squats, for instance, okay? And the reason is, if you're truly trying to improve power and speed, you need to do 3 things, okay? 1, you need to do them at the beginning of your sessions when you're most demanding of your central nervous system. This also means you should not be cramming them with other exercises, like we just talked about. The second thing you need to do is you need to be measuring and you need to be timing. And the reason for this is because if you start to notice a significant decrease in power or speed, then you're actually not training power or speed anymore, right? Because like I said, it needs to be done at maximum intensity. And the third thing is that you need long rest periods. Okay, so you're not going to be doing power and speed for 20 seconds on and 10 seconds off. Okay, if you're working as hard as you can, it's going to be for about maybe 10 seconds, and then you're going to be giving yourself a couple of minutes of rest. And this is because your anaerobic system is going to be the energy behind these exercises. So remember earlier when I said that squash is not an anaerobic sport, an aerobic sport? Hopefully I said that clearly. Squash is aerobic. That's because although the intensity is very high in squash, because the intervals are repeated without complete rest, the aerobic system is going to be the dominant energy system. Okay, so we can go over this more later, but when we are truly training speed and power, we are using the anaerobic system, and that's why we need so much rest. Okay. So if you are wondering how you are going to fit in power and speed work, I have a little workaround for you. So I just want to be clear about something. When I love putting in quite a lot of like volume, like maybe 10 minutes or so of power and power and plyos, etc. But I like putting them in at the beginning of sessions, like before squash, where it's not going to fry you. I like putting in low to mid-level plyos. Okay, so that means that it's a sub-maximal jump. So maybe you're just doing hurdle jumps, which are a foot off the floor, but not a 4-foot high hurdle jump, right? There's a very big difference in intensity there. Okay, and the reason I like putting them at the beginning of sessions is 1, because it's at the beginning, so you're going to be fresh for them, but also because they're great for neural activation, for coordination, which you're going to need for playing your sport or doing your exercises, and also for injury prevention. So the majority of how I program and do power and speed work is simply by integrating them in the beginning of my strength sessions and before ghosting. Okay, so it's really simple. Just take that first 10 to 15 minutes and put those exercises at the beginning of your on-court training or at the beginning of the gym sessions. All right, and something that I need to touch on before we go to the next slide is that something which is often overlooked in plyometrics, power, and agility is getting the basics right first. Okay, how often do we see really, really fancy drills that look awesome, but if they're done poorly or the athlete doesn't have the mechanics or the motor control to do them well, then they're just going to waste their time. And you're maybe even inviting a potential injury. So especially if you're working with young, older, or detrained athletes, okay, this is going to be a lot more people than you realize. It is very important to start with the fundamentals, especially at the beginning. So this means working on things like deceleration, and landing mechanics. So learning how to actually land from a jump squat, for instance, so that people don't get hurt. Because we get hurt jumping, we get hurt landing. So if you're working with a trainer, or if your athletes are working with a trainer, make sure that they're working on that foundation before trying complex exercises like high box jumps or big hurdle jumps or things like kettlebell swings. Those are all great ways to develop power, but we really want to be safe first, okay? Let's remember that our off-court training, we need that to complement our on-court training, okay? We don't want it to replace it, but we also do not want it to detract from our on-court. And if we get injured from off-court training, well, then we're certainly detracting from it, aren't we? Okay, last thing on power, agility, and speed. And we touched on this earlier, but I was talking about how we can integrate these methods. So what I like to do, because it flows so efficiently, is simply to do more gym-based exercises like box jumps, hurdles, kettlebell swings, etc., before strength workouts. And then I like to do agility, speed, and squash specific movement-based power like explosive lunges, either before playing or before ghosting. Okay, so you can see how you can integrate agility, power, plyos into your weekly sessions without having to dedicate an hour of time doing just those methods, because the reality is that they take a really long time to do, and they also leave your central nervous system fried. So I like to put a little bit in more often rather than taking an entire hour once a week to do those sorts of sessions. And finally, how much power do we really need for squash? So this is the last thing on this, but in squash, you do need to be powerful, right? There's no doubt about that. But pure strength and power does not comprise the majority of the sport of squash, right? We're not doing a hammer throw or a 100-meter sprint. What we need to do is to repeat difficult yet sub-maximal effort over and over again, the rest. That sounds pretty hard, doesn't it? But because of this, we really need to focus on the aerobic system and to doing those repeated efforts. And the good news about this is that the aerobic system is much more trainable than the anaerobic system. So you're gonna see good results and good progress if you train it consistently. Okay, so that's why conditioning is such an integral part of squash training. Okie dokie, we're on to the last component here. And actually, after I go through the recovery section, I might see if we want to go to questions or if we want to go into the specific examples where I go through a week of training, because I don't want to take up too much time. So go through a warm-up here. So I have lumped together mobility and flexibility, warm-up, cool-down, and recovery all together, not because they're unimportant, but because I want you to see the similar qualities that influence each other. So the thing with recovery is that every training is to stimulate a response and an adaptation. But if we cannot recover from all of this work, then we're not going to get any of the benefits. So we really need to, I think, start putting more of an emphasis on recovery as coaches and as athletes so that we are able to actually get the benefit from our training. Okay, so there's a few parts to a warm-up here, ideally done in this order. The first two can kind of be interchanged, but from then on, you want to follow that progression. So you want to do ideally some sort of light cardio for a few minutes just to bring up the core temperature, bring up the heart rate a bit. Then soft tissue work. So this could look like foam rolling for a few minutes, just a couple minutes. You don't want to be spending 10 to 15 minutes on foam roll. We're talking 3 minutes here, okay? Just like a little bit, just to improve the muscle stability. We're going to go into some mobility and flexibility. So mobility is the motion within the joint. Flexibility is the range of motion of the muscle. So like touching your toes, kind of, right? Like hamstring flexibility versus hip mobility, okay? And then we're going to go into some activation. And this is where you would see exercises involving those mini bands or bands. And we're going to be doing some band walks here and maybe some glute bridges. So this is where we are starting to activate the muscles. And it's kind of like some low level strength work. Finally, we're going to get into movement prep, and this is where you want to start out general and become gradually more specific. So we're going to start with things like hopping and skipping and jumping, just low level stuff, but just to get that coordination and get some movement going. And then you're going to start to integrate some exercises that might look like the split step. Okay, so you want to ideally, by the end of this warm-up, be really well equipped to go straight into a squash rally. Okay, so you're going to start out general with the little components that you need to be able to play squash. So you need to be able to do a split step, right? You need to be able to decelerate in a lunge. You need to be able to run to the ball with some speed. Okay, so you want to slowly add in exercises that are ultimately going to have you doing or be prepared to do squash movements. Okay, so you should be able to go straight into a rally. You shouldn't have to post drive, right, to warm up. All right, now let's talk about cool down quickly. And cool down is just as important as the warm up, but here we want to have the opposite effect. And the goal here is to slow everything and start that recovery process. Okay, warm up is about stimulation, whereas cool down needs to have the opposite effect. And the reason is that you need to activate the parasympathetic system, which is also known as the rest and digest system. And if you don't cool down properly, you're not going to recover as well, and you'll actually miss out on the adaptations from the session, or some of the adaptations that you could be getting from that session. So the parts cool down include bringing your heart rate down within about 20 beats per minute of your resting heart rate. So if your heart rate was up around 140 and your resting heart rate is about 50, you want to focus on maybe walking or biking very lightly so you can gradually bring it down to about 70 beats per minute. Once you do this, the next stage is to go into a recovery type position. So this will look something like a child's pose, right? And you want to focus on deep breathing here. And then the next stage is to do your foam rolling and your stretching for maybe about 5 to 10 minutes. Now, some days you might need to do this for a longer period of time, but I would say in general, you can probably keep this process to about 15 minutes in general. And if you can only do 5 to 10 minutes, you really will notice a difference if you are able to dedicate a little bit more time to this recovery process. The worst thing that you can do is just rush off the court, run into the shower, and then go straight to work. Okay? Not only has your nervous system not had a chance to calm down, but your muscles have also not been given any sort of treatment. Okay? So, and furthermore, for those coffee drinkers, and I am a coffee drinker, but this is something I've changed. If you have a cup of coffee right after your training session, you are just stimulating your nervous system even more. So if you are actually trying to improve your recovery, have the coffee or the caffeine before your session and avoid having it afterwards, okay? I'm sorry, I know I just burst your bubble there, but this is something that, it needs to be done. Okay, and then we are almost here at the end, but the last thing we're gonna quickly talk about is recovery session. Oops. And this is something that a lot of people don't do or don't do well, okay? So contrary to popular belief, recovery session is not just sitting on the couch. That would be a full rest day. A recovery session is a session which has an RPE, if you remember that scale we talked about of 1 to 10, an RPE of about 5, and it will bring your heart rate up a bit, but certainly not to maximal intensity. The goal here is to keep the duration on the shorter end to maybe about 40 minutes total, and to include some low and moderate intensity strength and conditioning work. And you also want to include some mobility and soft tissue work here as well. So a typical recovery session might look like foam rolling and breathing, and then some mobility and some cardio intervals, some body weight or strength exercises, and then finally a stretch or a foam roll to finish with. Now, since we are squash players, I want to fill you in on a little trick that I have come up with, and I often like to use it as a recovery session. It's perfect because it gets your heart rate up and you sweat a little bit, but it's not maximal intensity, and you can also dial it up or dial it down as you need to. What I love about using a solo hit as a recovery session is that it prompts you to do a proper warm-up beforehand so that you can really swing of things, no pun intended, quicker and make proper movements on court. So you'll see that in the tab in the document that I sent you guys that I have included a solo hitting recovery session template that you can use. This is also a great session to use in twice a day training. So if you're looking to increase the volume of your training at the beginning stages, or if your afternoon session is intense and you want to get some skill work in without using too much energy, this is a good session to add in. Also, we all know how drills and casual hits can drag on for a long period of time. So I actually prefer doing a solo hit as a default session in the morning because it's focused. And then I also don't risk overdoing it. And if I've got a pressure session or a match later on in the day, I tend to do a solo hit in the morning now because I can control the intensity and the time. Whereas if you're hitting with a partner and you're doing a casual hit, you often end up doing a bit too much and sometimes you'll be a bit flat later on. So not all the time, but if you are trying to ramp up your training, you want to do it gradually. And I find that a solo is a really good way to do that. Okay, so the last part here is about planning a week of training. Hopefully we have enough time here. Jeff, if we're struggling for time, just cut me off or give me some sort of a warning and let me know, okay? So planning a week of training, the most important thing here is to it is not one size fits all, okay? Even if you've got two different 15-year-old athletes, depending on what their goals are and their training abilities, they might not have the same week of training, okay? So we're gonna look at two different examples here. Case study number one. You have to excuse the picture here of Bruce. That is not how to hold a squash racket. You know what? He doesn't even need to work on any of the things we're talking about here because the first thing for him to change is his grip. I think you'd agree. So Bruce plays 3 times a week. He is an avid club player and he competes about 4 times a year. So not too much, but he still does like to improve and play well in competition. And his main issue is to be injury-free. He is a bit of an older athlete. He's about 60 years old and he never warms up. He never cools down, and he struggles a lot with recovery, partly because he works a stressful desk job, and also because, let's face it, he doesn't warm up and he doesn't cool down. Okay, so we're going to go about creating a week training plan for Bruce. And the main question I want you to ask yourself when creating a training plan is, what is the goal? And what methods do I need to get there? So in the first part of this webinar, we talked about the goals and what focuses for the training plan. And we just went over the methods, okay? So we are gonna combine those two and turn them into a weekly plan. So Bruce's goal, he wants to play consistently and he wants to be injury-free. So the methods that we want to include are warm-ups, cool-downs, recovery management, and strength training. So we've established that Bruce is on court 3 times a week. So let's say that he has a lesson, which is a medium intensity on Monday, a medium to hard intensity match on Wednesday, and on Saturday he has a round robin with him out because it's an hour and a half. Okay, so remember, we are looking at both intensity and duration when determining the overall load here. Okay, so 45 minutes is different than an hour and a half, right? So Warm-ups and cool-downs are very easy to integrate because they simply go before and after the squash session. So you want to make sure that Bruce has a dedicated warm-up and cool-down process. Now we've got to go about putting in sessions, okay? And this is where it's going to come into play with recovery management, because when I talk about recovery management, it's simply making sure that you have dispersed the intensity throughout the week. So you don't have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday at max intensity, and then the rest of the week, you're absolutely shot, okay? So it's making sure that you're dispersing those high intensity sessions throughout the week, which Bruce has done a very good job of that because he plays squash on Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday. So we want to integrate strength training because to improve his strength and reduce injury risk. So ideally, we want to do strength training on the non-squash days, and we also don't want to do them back-to-back days. So let's put them on Tuesday and Friday, as you see here. And we're also going to assume that Bruce is not doing max effort strength training since he's new to it. So it should not be a 9 out of 10, the RPE scale, but more of a 7 or maybe an 8. Okay, so that is Bruce's plan here. So you probably know a few Bruces. This is a pretty good template to go off of. I think most people are going to have to do some tweaking, right, depending on the individual, but I like this general format because he gets a nice midweek recovery day in there, which a lot of people don't do, so then he can finish the week out strong. Okay, and then the last part here, this is our second case study, Sarah. Again, another nice stock image I found. Okay, so Sarah, we're going to say that Sarah's 15 years old here. She is a busy, high-performance athlete on the cusp of making a regional or provincial team. She really needs to improve the consistency of her training and mainly her conditioning and her movement. So let's say that Sarah, she hits it super well. She hits a really good ball. She just needs to get fitter so that she can last longer in rallies, get to more balls, and really just cope with the increasing physical demands of the U17 game, right? We all know how U15 is different from U17, which is, even a step down from U19, where the rallies get even longer and get faster. So again, we're going to ask what is the goal? What are Sarah's goals? And what methods do we need to program to get her there? So Sarah needs to play consistently. She needs to increase her fitness and conditioning. And the methods that we're going to use are recovery management. Again, we're basically always going to include that. And on off-court conditioning. And this is going to be coming from a mixture of ghosting because she needs to improve quality and also just the quality of her on-court sessions. So this is Sarah's scheduled week. So you'll notice that we haven't loaded up Sarah with a ton of extra volume or extra work. Like we don't have a bunch of extra intervals thrown in here or anything. And this is because Sarah needs to be consistent, like we talked about. We do not want her to burn out midweek because this could lead to injury and also to mental fatigue. So the focus in this phase particularly is to get consistent quality. She's already getting 5 days of conditioning, but they're not all max intensity and they don't necessarily need to be, right? So she's getting conditioning on Monday with the pressure. Tuesday, there's conditioning. Thursday, she's getting conditioning in the match play and of course in the ghosting. And then Saturday, conditioning in match play and ghosting. And again, some conditioning, although lower intensity, in the swimming on Sunday. And she's a good swimmer, so that's something that she enjoys, which is important because it's giving her some variety. Now, as Sarah improves, she can increase the volume. So maybe she'll add on some more ghosting or conditioning to the sessions. And then after a period of about 4 to 6 weeks, she's going to scale back that volume, but start to ramp up the intensity. So this might mean doing ghosting even faster or shorter rest periods or etc. Okay, now while these are good starting points, right, both for Bruce and for Sarah, it's really important to monitor the program just as necessary because factors like mental stress from family, school, and work all detract from athletes' work capacity. So when this happens, right, when you've got a stressful meeting at work or, life happens, I recommend decreasing the volume, but keeping the recommended intensity if you can. Obviously, if you have not slept at all and you're meant to do a pressure session, you should turn that into a recovery or a medium day, and then try and move that pressure session or that high intensity workout to a day that you're more recovered. But this schedule gives you a framework to work with, and of course, you can adjust it as needed. Okay, so, okay, guys, that is all I had. We went through all of the methods and through a couple of case studies. So, Jeff, feel free to facilitate questions if we have any.
Great, thanks, Nicole. That was a fantastic presentation, and yeah, let's open the floor to any questions. If you have questions, as promised, we're willing to make this interactive. So if you want to put it in the chat, you can. I'll facilitate questions, or if you'd like to unmute, please go ahead and ask Nicole your questions. So please go ahead. Anyone have a question for Nicole?
Hey Jeff, it's Jamie here. I've got a question for Nicole.
Go ahead, Jamie.
Hey Nicole, great presentation. Quick one, could you walk us really quickly through 48 hours before a tournament, like your own personal routine, how you would approach the 48 hours before a tournament?
Yeah, I was actually asked this question this week by a kid. So let's say your first match is on Saturday morning. And so Thursday, I would say your last hard day of training or hard day might be on Thursday, and then you probably want a lighter day on Friday. What I would say is that Thursday, you want to keep the intensity high, but you want to decrease the volume, right? So if you're going to be doing, you want to include some high intensity work, but instead of doing an hour or 40 minutes, you might just want to keep that to 15 or 20 minutes. So 15 to 20 minutes of, higher intensity work, and then finish out with some skills and lower intensity work. So overall, you're still getting a pretty good session of maybe 45 minutes, but it's not all super high intensity. So you're going to be able to recover from it. That's what I would say, is keep that intensity up, but just decrease the volume.
Okay, a question from the chat here, Nicole, from Simon Hall, just asking for some clarification on what the RPE scale is.
Sorry. So RPE is rate of perceived exertion. I probably said that really, really fast as I went through it. So RPE, so it's just a way for you to how hard something felt. So, exerting yourself at a 10 out of 10 scale, which is absolute maximum intensity, then that would be a 10. Whereas sitting down on the couch watching something on TV would be like a 1 out of 10. So that's what that means. So ideally, you want your recovery sessions somewhere in the 4 to 5, and the medium intensity sessions probably a 7 or an 8. So still quite hard. And then the max intensity is upwards. And I may have forgotten to mention this. Shoot, if I did, I'm sorry. I think I forgot to mention this, but you only want about 2, maybe 3 max intensity sessions a week. Anything more than that, and if it's true intensity, then you're not going to be able to recover from it. And I think the mistake that a lot of people make here is that, they try and do max intensity 3 days back to back, but the reality is they're actually not doing a 9 out of 10 intensity. It just feels that hard, but they're not actually, if you were to measure the speed, we talked about measuring, you're not actually going to be getting that much out of it. Or sorry, you're not going to be getting a 9 out of 10 intensity. It's going to feel like it's 9 out of 10, but it's really a 7 or an 8 if you were to measure it. I think there was another question here. Something about ghosting. Did someone else see that question about ghosting? There we go. How to structure a ghosting session. Cool. So I think it depends on what you are working on. So I think I mentioned that right now I'm doing 2 different types of ghosting sessions a week. One of them is focused on technique, and the other one is focused on conditioning. So it's much more interval based. We're taking my heart rate during that session, and it's focused on how many targets I can hit basically within 30 seconds. I get 30 seconds rest, and then we repeat. So it depends entirely on what you're working on. Unfortunately, if you can give me a bit more clarification, then I can probably speak a little bit more specifically. But I think a good general way to do it is to start out with some of that movement prep like we talked about. So like the low-level plyometrics, practice some bounding, which is obviously going to help with a split step, and then move into some technique. So whatever technical skill you're trying to work on, maybe it's moving to the front, maybe it's moving to the back court, whatever it is. And then I would say finish with the conditioning part. So then you want to finish with something that's not very complex, but you can still work hard. So maybe you put out like 6 targets, and you're going to measure how many targets that athlete can hit within 30 seconds, and then repeat that 5 or 6 times or something. So that is a very general way of how you could fit everything in within one session. But of course, if you've got more time, I would say you want to split it up. Yeah. Hopefully that helps.
Great, thanks, Nicole. Any last questions from the group on the call today? Last call for questions. If you want to put in the chat or unmute your mic, please go ahead.
Hello, Nicole.
Hello.
Hi, it's Eugene here. I'm a coach at a university. I coach the men's squash team at Queen's. And
I know your son very well.
Oh, you do? Yeah, in Victoria. Right.
Yeah.
So, the kind of problems I have are a bit different from the kinds of things that you've addressed, and we have limited time to play on the courts. We have 3 practice sessions a week, and each of them is about an hour and 20 minutes. And we have up to 10, 12 players coming out for those practice sessions. So it's kind of hard to do a lot of the things that you've mentioned, which are geared towards, more, I guess, more dedicated players, more serious players. I'm just wondering if you have any sort of ideas about how you would perhaps run a practice which incorporates, the drills, the practice play, rallying and fitness and stretching and all that kind of thing. Do you have any
How
sort
many
of
courts do you have?
We have we have 6 courts. 6 courts for that period.
Okay, so you can get people.
So we
People
can
on
get
a court. It's not.
most people on the court for that session, right?
That's pretty good. So you don't have to do 3s. You can always do 2 people, which is good, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Nice. So
have you dealt with something like that, kind of a situation where you have a whole bunch of people coming out for a practice?
Yeah, so a couple of situations. I played college squash, so I'm pretty familiar with having to fit everything in, that's for sure. And then also here I've done some coaching, and you have to integrate as many methods as you can, right? So I think deciding one thing to try and do is to incorporate some of the methods, but not all of them into a practice. So, you want to make sure you're doing a warm up and a cool down every time, but it doesn't have to take 20 minutes, right? Get those kids on probably pretty soon, that's not a word. You can get them on court hopefully within 5 to 10 minutes, and part of that warm up is going to be some of their movement prep and their skills, which is going to lead them right into the drills, right? So maybe, and that's where you can work on that mobility. That's where you can work on the plyometrics and those movement-based skills that are actually going to help them become better movers. So I would say, if you say an hour, 20 minutes. So I would say maybe, 5 minutes working on just a bit of mobility at the beginning, and then maybe 5-ish minutes working on some plyometrics, maybe almost 10 minutes working on some plyometrics and agility, and that's going to get them really, really warm. And then I would say you've got almost an hour after that. That takes you to 15 minutes. You've got almost an hour you can spend on squash work, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And depending on what the focus is for that day, if you're doing match play, they play a match. And then maybe at the end, they could do a bit of ghosting for conditioning. Or perhaps it's more of a drill-based session, and you could intersperse some little sections of ghosting in between. Let's say every 5 to 7 minutes, or at the end of every game, or at the end of every drill, they do a couple minutes of ghosting. So that's how you can kind of like fit in the conditioning. I would say, so that's for strength. For strength work, it really depends on whether you're going to be doing it on court or whether they're going to be doing it off court. Does that answer most of your questions with the on court methods and how to
Yeah, I
integrate
think
those?
that's very helpful. Your whole presentation was excellent, and I really got a lot of information out of it. And I have to admit that my practices are not quite as structured as what you have presented, of course, and I'd like to incorporate a lot of what you've said into what I'm doing.
Thank you. Yeah, hopefully, if you want to talk about this, I'm happy to talk about it with you on another call, and we could probably talk a bit
Sure.
more
Okay, I'll pass it on to
specifically.
somebody else. Okay, thanks very much, Nicole.
You're welcome.
Great. Thank you, Nicole. And that was a great question, Eugene. In the interest of time, again, with all Squash Canada Coach PD webinars, our presenters are always happy to chat with you afterwards. If you have questions, you can always email me or email Nicole directly, and we're always happy to help where we can. So on behalf of Squash Canada today, Nicole, thank you so much for your presentation, and I think everybody left today with a ton of valuable information on how to create a well-rounded training plan. For everybody still on the call, just a friendly reminder, we have 2 more Coach PD webinars left for what I would deem to be this season before we take a break for the summer. June 8th, we have Jesse Engelbrecht doing a presentation on Squash Mind, a mental skills toolkit, and there'll be some surprise free codes given away to Jesse's app called Squash Mind. So we hope you'll register for that on June 8th. And then the final presentation on June 23rd will be COVID-friendly squash programming by Mark Porter. Some of you may have seen this presentation already if you're in Ontario, but we are now doing this one nationwide. Squash Ontario has encouraged us to do one for the entire country, so we hope you'll consider registering for that as well on June 23rd. Otherwise, thank you again, everybody, for attending today's Coach PD webinar. And again, thank you, Nicole. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, guys.